So why don't we go ahead and get started? I'm sure a couple more folks will join us. I want to welcome everybody to the first meeting of the President's Management Advisory Board. As an advisory board to the President, the President's Management Advisory Board is subject to the Federal Advisory Committee Act, which it makes us very happy to have a webcast going on today so we can provide public access to the board's activities. The President established the board because he believes there's a big opportunity, and I concur here, and my colleagues who help run the major agencies certainly concur, that there's a big opportunity for us to improve government performance by bringing best practices from different sectors, in particular the private sector. There is what we've captured as a productivity gap, and I have one handout on this that I'll pass around the table. As all of you know, as corporate leaders across the last couple of decades, and this is the top line on the chart, private sector productivity has increased year over year. 1.5%, 2% a year compounding, and the compounding effect is dramatic. Really across the last few decades, that's happened year over year. Federal government productivity is hard to measure. In fact, 15 or so years ago, the government stopped trying to measure it, in ironically a cost-cutting move. The effort was stopped, so that's why the line becomes dotted rather than solid, that bottom line. But I think we're all fairly confident that there's a big gap between what's happened in the private sector in terms of productivity and what's happened here in the federal government. And that gap is actually our opportunity. And we're hoping that all of you can help contribute to our efforts to close that gap and to do a step function increase in productivity in our sector, the federal government. What I'd love to do is just go quickly around the room, if people can just say their name and their organization and their position, and then we're going to quickly get into substance here.
Okay. Shantanu Narayan, President and CEO of Adobe Systems.
Sam Gilliland, Chairman and CEO of Sabre.
Greg Brown, President and CEO of Motorola Solutions.
Debbie Lee, Chairman and CEO of BET Networks.
Tim Solso, Chairman and CEO of Cummins, Inc.
Excuse me, I'm Ron Williams. I'm the Executive Chairman of that.
Jeff Kindler, former CEO and Chairman of Pfizer.
John Barry, Director of the Office of Personnel Management.
Scott Gould, Deputy Secretary of the VA. Enrique Salem, President and CEO of Symantec.
Liz Smith, CEO of OSI Restaurant Partners.
Great. Well, thank you again for agreeing to serve. And with this group of leaders and companies represented at the table, you can see how we're optimistic that you can help us close that productivity gap. What we're going to try to do today in the next hour and a half or so is to put on the table some of the key management and operational challenges we're grappling with at the President's Management Council, which is the senior-most management body across the federal government, comprised of deputy secretaries from the major agencies. You're going to hear from several of them today, starting with Scott and John in just a second. The four areas that we're going to cover are leadership development, information technology, contracting and the supply chain, and customer service, all areas that we think are highly leveraged across agencies in our effort to close that productivity gap. So John and Scott are going to kick us off. They're going to do a very brief presentation, a few slides, just to give you a little background on the issue of leadership development. And then what we're really hoping to do is to have that conversation catch with all of you, where you learn more about the issues they're grappling with, and then ultimately we're going to decide across the next few weeks which of these issues, or other issues that might surface, which topics we should cover for our first round of work for the President's Management Advisory Board. Scott is the Deputy Secretary at the VA, and John Barry leads the Office of Personnel Management, which sets personnel policy across the federal government. Scott, John.
So, good morning. First of all, I was in the room when I saw you raise your right hand and take the oath of office, and congratulations. I really appreciate the fact that you have done that.
And thank you for serving your country. Very appreciative.
So John and I are going to do very quickly three things. First, we're going to set the context for the people environment in the federal government. Next, we'll talk a little bit about the government-wide efforts that are underway. And lastly, we'll invite you to identify some potential areas of interest where the PMAB could engage. So on the first slide, developing
The
leaders.
slide is, if we're behind tab, which number? Four.
So the federal government has a lot of people, about 1.8 million folks, excluding the post office and another 1.5 million active duty. We're just going to be talking about 2,000 political appointees and about 7,000 senior executives. You can think of senior executives, for those of you who've been in the military, as the equivalent of a flag officer. The performance appraisal systems that we currently use in the system typically discriminate, 4 to 5 different levels of performance, outstanding on the high end, unsatisfactory on the other, and predictably, our system does not do well at discriminating between levels of performance. It's sort of chi-squared, very, very high at the outstanding level. Almost 80% of folks measured as outstanding in this system. We've been working really hard, and I'll describe in a moment what we've been doing to try to fix that. It's also a system that's highly attenuated with respect to accountability. My old background at IBM, I can tell you that in that environment, if you're brought in to solve a problem, there are 3 key questions you get asked. Do you know what went wrong? Can you say clearly what you're going to do to fix it? Or do we need a new you? That level of clarity, that sort of clarifying moment of accountability can be attained and achieved in government, but it's very, very difficult. And this will come up over and over again as we talk about people management in the government environment. There are very limited development opportunities for our executives. Frankly, government underinvests in training. Less than 2% of senior execs in any given year get to rotate to another agency, as an example. And money, which is used for training, is usually identified as the first thing to cut when you're up on the hill and looking for an opportunity to reduce costs. I don't want to overplay this next point, but we have limited flexibility with respect to executive compensation. About 120 to 180K is the range. Throw in another 15% in terms of performance award at the end of the day. And the reason why I don't want to overplay that is that we think we've got the mission that matters along with the non-governmental organizations. It makes a big difference. It attracts people to serve in government. It matters. It's part of the non-pecuniary compensation that we have to offer. But there you go. It's tough when you're looking for a senior program manager with a certain skill set to go out and compare that 180K max to whatever the private sector is offering. And lastly, we've got a brain drain coming up. Half of the senior execs right now, those flag officers I was talking about a moment ago, are in a position where they could retire. Many of them are still under the old system, which means that they walk into a world in which they have about 80% of their compensation for the rest of their lives. So right now, on a dollar-for-dollar basis, if you're in that system, the old one, you're working for cheap. On the next slide, our efforts in leadership development have basically gone on 3 levels. The first is a government-wide effort to really improve performance management systems, streamline acquisitions, improve strategic planning. The idea is simple here. If you bring good people into a government environment and the system prevents them from doing what they know how to do well, you're going to lose them pretty quickly. Next here, led by John Barry, is really now looking at the personnel policy component of that, also on a government-wide basis. And here you can see a very systematic effort on the part of the President and Director John Barry to strengthen the linkage between those strategic plans that Jeff Science is asking us to produce with individual performance, to establish that link fundamentally, to do more training, to provide rotational opportunities for executives in government, to develop a government-wide capability to get more talented senior execs in the mix, kind of opening that up to an all-source approach. And finally, developing, if you can identify them, an opportunity for folks to get on board in training over year-long periods. This is a new environment. As you move from one sector to the other, it requires new skills, and you need to orient folks to that environment. At the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs, where I'm the Deputy Secretary, we have about, quickly to orient you, about 300,000 people, 3 major operating units, direct health care, largest in the country, a benefits system, and a cemetery system. And what we're doing at an agency level to implement some of these policies from OMB and from OPM just mentioned a moment ago is we've taken the number of outstandings and cut them in half. So we've gone from 80% to 40% in the last 2 years. We now require developmental plans for 100% of our executives. We make sure that we interview every single, at the secretarial level, chief of staff or myself, sit down and interview every new candidate who's coming into the system to see if we can make that connection between our mission and the talent that's sitting in front of us. We've invested a lot in training and leader development. We're partnering with a leading business school. We've created a change academy where we can take dedicated teams into an off-site environment, walk through the skills, put the problem on the table, and then actually work through team building and skills development on site. And finally, but perhaps most importantly, with a leader like Secretary Shinseki, sitting down on a daily basis, going through the dialogue, the coaching, the mentoring, the testing of assumptions to make sure that people are thinking about these problems in a new way and becoming better leaders themselves. On the third and final slide, here are some questions we really have for you. I think for a moment around the table, the talent, the perspective, the organizations that you manage and lead, boy, there's a lot under the hood here. First question, how should the government develop our SES training, our mentoring, our private sector partnerships? What could we do there? Right now, the system is basically an apprentice program. I had 1,500 of my financial managers in a training course last fiscal year. I asked them, any individual who had been trained in the last 10 years to raise their hand. Maybe 25 people did. I mean, just an indictment of our system and level of investment of the personnel involved. Second question might be for discussion, what system should we put in place to identify the high potential employees that are in the system? So over and over again, you'll hear us thinking about the folks who are currently there, strengthening, improving their performance, reaching into our own organizations, the people who have self-identified, who want to be in public service, who have made the choice to make this a career. How can we find them and develop them? And then how can we look outside our own agencies and government to bring them in from other state and local government agencies? About 18 million people do that work in America. There's a lot. From non-governmental organizations that may have developed the talent over time, and yes, even from the private sector. We'd like to steal a couple of good folks if you have. Third area is we would only do this if we can grab the resources to make that happen. So fundamentally, and this is something that John does for us all the time, he's making the case for investment in the people element of government. The chief people officer's got to be able to make the case for that. Can you help us make that business case for leader development in government itself? A lot of folks aren't convinced. And then finally, how can we attract top leaders and make them most effective?
So Scott, since you went first, you're going to see each time a couple of slides, which give a few minutes of background on the problems and the issues and the opportunities. The third slide each time will be an attempt that if we as a group were to take this on, these are the types of questions that we might address and look for corporate learning on these topics. So now we're going to open it up with Scott and John for 5-10 minutes of questions. Not in an attempt to answer these questions, but more around should we pick this as a terrain, so pick questions about what's really going on or how we might be able to help. Jeff?
So I just have questions for information
Please,
to
that's
learn about. Just, it sounds like at the VA you've done a lot to improve the performance appraisal. So I'm interested in what the points of leverage are to, once you've identified either outstanding or par performers, what you do about it.
Right.
So you mentioned a portion of variable compensation, and so I'm interested if you could tell me what mechanisms do you have, either financial or otherwise, to reward good performers, to get rid of poor performers, and to otherwise, once you have good performance appraisal standards, to do what you need to do. That third question that you asked at IBM.
Great question. So we try to focus on three things. The first is just recognition. When a system is more closely aligned with identifying the actual outstanding performers, I think they feel better about it and they realize that their performance is being differentiated from others on the team, number one. Number two, promotion opportunities. So even though they are senior executives, there are promotions to bigger jobs and bigger opportunities. Inside the VA system. A senior executive, for example, might move from the chief of staff role at a major hospital to be the network director of a $500 million to a $2 billion insurance enterprise, healthcare enterprise.
Not a lot of comp room within.
No,
that.
not
You
much at
tap
all.
out pretty quickly, but.
So there's not much you can do with comp.
Correct. That's exactly right. And then the last is the challenge. We're looking for folks that want the challenge. You find them through the performance evaluation process, and then you get them on to the next exciting
More
thing to do.
responsibility.
More responsibility.
What about eliminating poor performance? What is your flexibility there?
We have eliminated 20 senior executives in the last 2 years from the BA environment. It is extremely difficult to do, quite frankly. And the rule set strongly favors the individual's claim that they have been wronged as opposed to management's judgment that they have not performed well. So on that spectrum, it's more towards the individual rights. It therefore takes quite a long while to be able to go through the process, frankly, a fair one, with lots of outside participation and lots of documentation, to put an individual on a performance improvement plan, to give them a 90-day period to correct their deficiencies, and then to reach a conclusion kind of for the good of the order and that individual that they really need to be on to the next job.
If I could just add in and jump in there with Scott. The SES is under, its pay is set entirely by performance. It's different from the GS schedule that encompasses the bulk of the federal employment. You have wide latitude to, it's the closest you get in the federal government to at will. And you can remove an SESer much easier than the others. And the good news is if you actually go through the process Scott described with notice, opportunity to correct, and then action, those actions are upheld over 98% of the time. So even though people do have appeal rights and could drag things out, they're not in the job while that's going on, and generally management's decisions are upheld. So it does have that. On the bonus side of the equation, if you sort of look, the average pay for the SES is $167. The average bonus is about $14,000. We have a distinguished rank award program that is awarded by the president. It is a very highly scrutinized program. Less than 1% of the senior executive are eligible for that, but that comes with a significant remuneration of up to 30% of pay. That is traditionally recognized as lifetime achievement or really outstanding achievement, breakthrough kind of models. So it gives you a sense of, just to give you a scale on both sides.
What's the average tenure of a SES?
I would say they hit it at about the 25-year point, although there are exceptions, and they typically stay in 10 years.
That's about 10.
Again, a lot like the flag officer committee.
25 years when they're promoted to the SES ranks.
Correct.
And then at that point,
10 years.
about 10 years.
One of the big, if I could, just one other quick point before I'm sorry to jump in there, Sam. One of the big problems we have right now, in addition, is sort of the public perception that federal employees are overpaid vis-a-vis the private sector. And what has happened is our GS system gets the employment cost index adjustment, sort of if you will, a COLA. And so that system constantly adjusts every year. The SES system only adjusts by law. And so the starting salary is $119, has now been lapped by our GS system. When you are a GS system, you have many more performance protections that restrict management's actions. Something else that we can do that is performance related that doesn't require removal is a senior executive service can be reassigned at will, and that's not appealable. And so a manager Scott can move his folks around. If someone is in a job where they're over their head, they can be pulled and reassigned like that. And so the GS system, you can't do that. And so right now, our GS 15 is almost completely lapped by the SS system. So getting to people to say, okay, we want you to take this promotion assignment. Oh, by the way, you get a cut in pay or a freeze in pay, and you surrender all of your rights.
Right.
Is one of the other big problems that we're facing.
Can
Are
I
there
ask
questions?
scope
Liz?
questions? Yeah, I have a couple just scope questions that are within the MAB. So what you're talking about, that structure and the percentage of what I call pay that is fixed versus variable, Is that within scope of this group, or is that all purview of law and legal, so that we shouldn't be advising on that?
The pay range is set in law, and that's one of the limitations.
But how about the percentage of
variability,
fixed and variable?
We have wide latitude in terms of, and that's what Scott and I are demonstrating within our own agencies and trying to model behavior for others, is how you can use existing performance evaluation, you can use the existing recognition system, and it would be great benefit to have sort of a best practice exchange between those two to help us, accomplish that.
Second quick question. You had said that 25 people raised their hand on training. Is that training as defined formal training where you're taken out of your job? Because an awful lot of, obviously, training happens as the result of your direct manager. And then I guess a question for you is, for managers, are there direct goals on how the expectation of how you are training the individuals under you?
So Liz, I was the one who made mention of that, the 1,500 financial management, and only 25 people raised their
Assume
hand.
that was classroom training.
It was classroom training, that formal investment. And without it, folks either are educating themselves or going out and getting the master's degree or getting a certificate on their own and paying for it, which you see a lot of initiative on that. But there has not been much investment in structured training, at least speaking for my own agency.
So just a quick question, just for clarification. So a lot of us, I think, have experience with kind of on-the-job training is really and the responsibility and effectiveness as your manager is, I think, where the real pivot action is.
Yes.
What is structurally in the performance management system that requires managers to develop their people, and is that within the purview of this group and recommendations?
Could well be in the purview, and would be a great area of inquiry for us. How we handle that in our performance appraisals for senior executives, we do require. So we're asking senior execs to be that senior kind of mentor, coach, counsel. What we're not talking about here today is how we extend that reach into the GS level. This is the top half of 1% that we're talking about here, the SES and the political appointees. The GS level below that really need a lot more.
This focus goes to 7,000 people. The workforce is 2 million, so it gives you a sense. But they're the leadership.
Ron?
Thank you.
Yeah, a couple of questions. One is, who owns the succession and talent assignment for this cohort of 7,000? Is it the agency they're in, their direct supervisor, the management council? Who owns the top talents of the organization?
The agencies have broad latitude in this. They're the ones who actually do the hiring and the firing. OPM sets the general policy structure within which they operate. And so we set the bumpers, if you will, and then agencies have broad latitude.
But Ron, you're on to an important issue in that when the SES was originally conceived and launched, the theory was there'd be a lot of rotation so that agencies would work together with the SES core. There's not much of that, for better or for worse. I mean, it's an open question because an agency says, I've got a group, there's expertise required to run a VA hospital, certainly.
Right.
And I'm not sure I want my best talent rotating. Others would say that type of rotation, particularly early, either whether it's part of the developmental path for the SES or the early years of the SES, might be invaluable training and learning. So that's an issue that we're struggling with which if we were to choose this terrain, I would think we'd want your counsel on.
And Ron, in a typical SOX environment, for every one of those senior execs, I'd have 2 internals and an external candidate, and I'd map them against each one. Somebody gets hit by a bus, you move forward, you got that set. In our environment, we can't do that. We can't do much of it because it amounts to pre-selection for the job. So who made that judgment? How did you do it? If it becomes apparent, then other people, well, I'm not going to stick around here at the next level down. I'm going to move. So there's some perverse incentives at work there as you step up to a very natural, very sensible question of how you do succession planning and development.
The second question is, in the appraisal and performance management system, what weight is given to both results and leadership skills? I mean, how do you think about those 2 quadrants of capability?
Leadership represents about 40% of the, if you will, of the average performance plan. There are core elements, and leadership is obviously the bulk of the core element. But then each agency can specify within that, linking the broader leadership to their specific mission and goals to break that down.
We should do one more question and change topics.
At the very top of the SES, long-term leadership development is a multi-year process. the relationship between the top of the SES and the political appointees, I mean, how do you accomplish continuity in this role over time? Because leadership sort of flows down, and if there's ambiguity or uncertainty, how do you accomplish that?
A couple of quick points. One is I did not mention, but the political appointees have an average tenure of 2 years. Boy, are they rotating through the process. And I think that connection is critical to managing well in government. At the VA, the ratio of political appointees to career is 1 to 9,000. In DOD, it's about 1 to 2,000. And in most federal agencies in government, about 1 to 500. So it's critical at VA, I think especially, that we establish that link well, that it's a true partnership. But frankly, a lot of political appointees come in with varying degrees of background, some highly literate in management, others kind of policy wonk, some professors. They're brought in for a variety of reasons, and to good effect, they create the full team. But you find very uneven exposure to managing at scale.
What is important, if I could just build on that, is I think the senior executive service is what creates civil society in the United States. All right, they are the continuity of government as we transition between political branches and people who come in and go for 2 years. And the folks who really make the United States government work is our senior executive service. And we are facing, as Scott referenced, sort of thing, a crisis in terms of, American public opinion is turning on public employees. And rather than as sort of in Singapore where they are held up and it's a revered thing and it's recognized, you can't run capitalism without this. You cannot operate a civil society and have free trade and all the things we take for granted in the United States without this kind of professionalism that gives you that continuity. And what Scott and I and Jeff are wrestling with is trying to sort of swim upstream against a public opinion current, recognizing how the criticality of this. And that's why we would really welcome your thoughts and benefits as to how we can do this better, because I think you could also help us on that credibility issue with the public. If CEOs are saying this, it's obviously, when I carry that message, it's suspect. When you say that message, the American people will listen. So I could see this being a very effective partnership to get this right.
Okay,
Can I ask a real quick question, just so I understand the scope of this? So the perverse nature of compensation, hiring, firing, everything that you described, this is a very naive question, but should we just assume that is not changeable? I mean,
Actually, the breadth of scope in terms of hiring and firing for the senior executive service will be very broad. That the law gives us, we can set performance standards very broad, and we can hold accountability very broad, and we could design systems within the scope of the law, especially for the senior executive service, that would give us wide latitude, and that's why I think
it's
Scott and I feel.
so just be limited by our
But if I-
imagination at this
But
point.
if I listen to what you're saying and to Liz's question too, compensation is set by law. There's latitude of the 7,000 for hiring and firing. But if you go to the variability question, if you were to change the composition of it, you wouldn't go to these SES people who have some been lapped by GS-15s and say, I have a deal for you. You make 167, you're actually going to make 140. But we're going to put more at risk.
Greg, my sense is
Right.
if we believe that the major contribution to this terrain is comp strategies, which it might be from the private sector, it's probably not a terrain to pick. It's not to say if we pick the terrain, we won't look at comp strategies, but I think we'd have to decide that there's real potential in
Other
training,
But how
rotations.
broad is it? Is it comp strategy? Is it hiring and firing? Is it
Performance
What-
accountability.
I think performance accountability in this SES
Fair
terrain
game.
is absolutely
That's
fair.
very
And
fair.
Training and
Scott's,
leader development.
Scott's
Yeah.
done some pioneering work here to show the effect. But I think if it's if our primary interest is comp strategy,
No.
I would
Well, it
argue
sounds like
that-
the other major area of opportunity is the one Ron raised, when nobody owns the whole cohort. What Ron was describing is a very familiar phenomenon in the corporate world.
Yes.
Siloed ownership of leadership.
Yes.
Yep.
And,
Great topic.
and to the extent that that can be integrated and somebody at the top is looking out for all 2,000 people.
That's right.
And ensuring rotation, talent development, this is what I think you were
Perform-
getting
real-
at.
real performance
That's a
reviews.
huge opportunity
Absolutely.
missed. And the way you described it, when it was created 30 years ago, there was some hope that everybody would just sort of get along and
Yes.
give up their people. That's contrary to human
And
nature.
then below that,
And
where's
that sounds to me like something that there's no legal barrier
Absolutely.
to
And
addressing.
then you have to add
And
to
something
it,
we
the next
probably
generation.
could.
Where's the next generation coming
Right.
from?
So that strikes me,
Good.
there's no legal barrier to us
Absolutely.
offering ideas to address
I've got
that.
the difficult task of being timekeeper.
Okay.
Thank you,
Thank
guys.
you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great to meet you all.
Thank you.
Good. Next, customer service. We're going to have Tony Miller. Tony, join us. Tony is actually has quite a bit of private sector experience, having been in McKinsey and private equity on the West Coast, and we're lucky to have him as the Deputy Secretary of Education. And Vivek Kundra, who you'll see a couple times today, who is the Federal Chief Information Officer, oversees the $80 billion or so we spend each year on IT. Tony, we're on page 6.
Page 6. We'll go through this pretty quickly. Customer service, what are the takeaways? Not surprisingly, as government, we have a tremendous amount of customer interactions. Second point, not surprisingly, we don't necessarily consistently handle those interactions in kind of a consistent, high-quality, low-cost way. And so a lot to learn from practices all around. Lastly, that said, there are some really interesting pockets of and examples of effective customer interactions and customer service initiatives that we can build upon. But like in anything, when it's not necessarily inculcated into the culture, how can we do more, better, faster? So that's the headline. On page 6, you'll see, be it on online, bricks and mortar, or telephone, we have thousands of interactions that total hundreds, over 100 million interactions with customers in some way, shape, or form on a monthly basis. That said, the bottom part of the page, if you look at benchmark surveys, there is a real dissatisfaction with the level of service that people and satisfaction that people receive are perceiving. There is exceptions to that, and Scott Gould, my counterpart at VA, right, and their cemetery services would be an exception. So that's not consistently across every service area, but by and large, there's a dissatisfaction. Not all of our key services are online, even in this day and age. And because of privacy concerns, security concerns, they're the natural barriers, especially if you're in a risk-averse environment, a highly scrutinized environment, that's both from the Hill, from an Inspector General's perspective, that, again, it keeps you from kind of pushing the envelope and moving to new channels and new ways. And then lastly, in terms of the culture, this notion of kind of getting ongoing customer feedback that you would do if you're providing a service for compensation, to how do you treat your product, the services you're providing. We don't do that kind of on a consistent, regular basis. We have some mechanisms in place, but they're much more episodic, annually as part of.
What do you mean because of the culture?
Just because if you will, it's just like in some ways, is there a strong incentive to reduce your cost in government? It's not clear what the incentives that reward that. Is there a strong incentive to really provide superior customer service? It's not clear that those feedback mechanisms are in place either. And so where you have, I could sell more products, deliver more services, increase customer retention, you don't have those natural incentives. And so, not surprisingly, those muscles of how do you actually pulse and understand what your customer's needs are not nearly as developed here. Next page. So things going around, examples can be across government, and I can speak a little bit about what's going on in our agency. We continue to more services online. For example, immigration status and leveraging new mobile platforms. So, we clearly understand that there are new capabilities that are emerging, and selectively we're taking advantage of those. We are working to make it easier because things are regulated in terms of what information can you get and how frequently and with what kind of burden, which is an appropriate thing to monitor, but we are trying to streamline that practice so that we can get more access to more timely information. And we're trying to put more metrics in place because, again, it's hard to improve customer service if you don't have a good definition and metrics of customer service. Specifically in our agency, some examples would be basically the application that students use to access federal student aid. We joked about it that it's almost like you have to have, historically you almost have to have a college degree to really understand how to fill it out. But we've kind of significant investment to use skip logic, automated, pre-populated, pull information, working with IRS to make significant improvements with that, so it makes it more accessible. It's very much consistent with the mission, because if more, especially undereducated minority, people who may be first generation, if it's easier for them to access aid, it's more likely that they are going to access it and be able to pursue a higher education. So it's very mission-centric. But again, that's an example of what we're trying to do. We're also trying to, specifically leading to the last discussion, build it into our performance management processes. So you actually create more of an incentive in terms of how you're providing service internally to your peer groups if you're a central office function, but also a lot of what we do is in grant making. What are our grantees saying about the service that we're providing, and how do we bring that in? I think the tension is, how much do you put this on performance management versus how much do you put this on kind of professional development and feedback, and kind of getting that balance right. And then lastly, we're trying to bake this into some of our systems, so consistent with how can our external service recipients have more tailored access, what we can draw down resources, we can have more flexibility in how we choose to access it versus to have you define it for us or us to have us. So those are the kinds of things that we're trying to do. But again, on page 8, which is just the transition to the discussion, it really is, how do we actually migrate to new channels? And I think especially in an environment where we're going to be increasingly fiscally constrained, there's an economic, right? There's an economic incentive to what are the more lower cost channels that we can do? And you see that all the time in industry. Separate from that, how can we continue to get good customer feedback so we can get better and create that? And then lastly, kind of at a high level, and how do you really build a culture? Because again, as you think about the federal government, it's just like any multinational corporation where there are multiple business units with multiple divisions, with multiple geographies. And so at any given, you may have some great things going on, but the real challenge is trying to do that with more consistency, but not being overly restrictive, and try to do it as a culture and as a consistent process. And that's what we're facing.
So if I can ask you a quick, so if you take that first question, I mean, how far along are we on the multi-channel ability? And so what I mean is everything from self-service to chat to all the things that probably most of the folks around this table have already started to progress as far as taking care of customers. I mean, how far along are we on already adopting those self-service online technologies? I mean, are we just...
So Vivek, you were to benchmark, so let's set the leading edge private sector at 100. Where are we relative to that index?
Probably at 20. And the reason is because you have very uneven execution. So agencies like the IRS are much further along because they've moved towards e-filing, they've moved towards online support and self-service, whereas the majority of the other agencies, unfortunately, because if you look at how the government is also organized, it's based on an industrial era model where everything is bureau by bureau, department by department, and that is complicated by the statutory constraints, but we're much further behind than the type of services you access in the consumer space especially.
I mean, the reason I asked the question though is because this is a fairly well-worked, best practices are available. You know, it's not like this group would say, let's go build some whole new set of best practices. I mean, this is a well-traveled, and what it requires, quite frankly, is leadership at the top that's willing to say, we're going to make an investment and stick with that investment over a period of time. I mean, I don't want to oversimplify, but it's a multi-year investment to achieve the multi-channel, better quality of service.
Well, I think there has to be a recognition by the leaders that this is an important thing.
Well,
to
that's
do,
it. Yes.
And give it a high priority, because it starts with your third bullet point, and that's the culture. Because if you don't have an attitude that this is important and that we're going to get better at it, then you can have all those systems in place that it won't work.
I agree with you.
And if I could just, and I think translating that at least in our environment, looking to the lab, because it's a multi-year sustained and you have leadership that is churning every 2 years, you need to actually build a shared leadership model that your senior career executives are also bought into this and are developing those kinds of skills so that they can lead it during the transition so it doesn't dissipate. I think that's...
The thing that comes to mind out of both of the conversations, though, is that if you think about each of these as pilot groups, you know, do you have the ability to then leverage it across the whole, I don't know how many agencies there are. So the idea here is to, you know, refine something and really make it work and then apply it across everything.
You know, the glass half full, and then I'll pivot right to where you are, Tim, is that in each one of these areas, there are some leading edge agencies. And what we're trying to do is get that from a couple to more than a handful. And that's how we envision doing this. So if we were to pick customer service, we'd have Tony sign up and lead a group of deputies, 5, 6, or 7, who say, I care about this.
Okay.
My senior executive service cares about this. now, and then, Amika, your point, we're not looking for blinding new insights, but what's worked, what hasn't worked, and how do we help that group of 5 or 6 turbocharge their efforts, so then a year from now or 2 years from now, we have a lot of best practices that we can point to, and we spread that across the other agencies across time. So that's the multiplying effect we're looking for.
But Tony, I mean, so if you think about people rotating in and out as one problem, clearly, you know how to do this stuff. You can get people that can help you with it. What other types of things do you run into when you try to implement new, kind of a new customer service model?
A couple, and feel free for others to jump in. One is defining the customer, quite frankly. And so as simple as the basic that is, to get the uniformity, you have different definitions. So it's not always a purchasing customer, right? But in our case, we're giving grants, but we're also giving student aid. Well, one is an institutional customer. Well, that's a different set of interaction because who speaks for the customer? And it's because you have different definitions of who the customer is within the institution. So you have the complexity of defining the customer is one. A more natural, I think there's a consistent skill gap I would find in how do you metricize things across. But again, my experience and others. And so even once you have a definition of how do you translate, okay, what are then the interactions and what dimensions of those matter most that you can then start measuring, and so that's not something that we have an inherent deep repository of skills.
And if I can add to that, the other big gap is privacy and security in the public sector in terms of the IRS not being able to share information, for example, with the Department of Education. So what Tony was able to accomplish in terms of simplifying the student aid form, it actually took a lot of lawyers sitting down together saying, well, how do we make sure we can actually leverage technology so that the person applying can say, it's my data, click, auto-populate the Department of Education website. And secondly, I think from a customer perspective, the American people don't really care how government is organized, whether it's federal, state, or local. But if you're starting up a small business, for example, you've got to file your taxes at the local level, formation at the state level, and then at the federal level, and they all have different regulatory compliance requirements, coupled with statutory requirements around how that information is supposed to be safeguarded.
I think the other thing, which gets to the last point about this this notion of the culture, I think and this would be great to get you all's experience on. What also happens is, it becomes, this is the latest initiative. And so again, you have, by definition, right, when leadership comes into Washington, right, new administration, it's always with an agenda and a set of initiatives. That is, by definition, what you're trying to do. Just like transitions with CEO leadership. It's, okay, here's where we're trying to take the organization. And so you do get this notion of initiative and change fatigue, which is, it's just perennial. And so on things that are multi-year, and so be curious and understand, as you grapple with that, what are the tools and techniques to deal with them?
Let me give you just one thought though. One thing that's always helpful in this, if you go back to page 6, it actually talks specifically about how many contacts you're actually doing, and it can actually, you can use that as saying, here's what it costs. There's a dollar amount associated with this page, so that every new leader that comes in can stare at it and say, this is costing my organization $2 million in personnel, because we do it all manually or whatever. So the more you can quantify for everybody what is the total spend on this, then you can start thinking about, everybody can see the opportunity as you go through it, right? Every time they come in, they see it's $10 million a year I'm spending.
Can I ask you something? What I'm hearing from the last two is that these are very observable, very concrete. The challenge that you're presenting to us is, how do you embed and proliferate them across an organization? Not that, boy, we all know we should buy from one vendor and leverage scale. The question is, why haven't we? What perspective can you gain from this organization on why those, as you point out, those kind of obvious benefits haven't taken hold and been proliferated horizontally? Not because people know they exist, you all know they exist, but how have we in our organizations led the cultural change, the stick-to-itiveness? That's what I'm hearing. Is that?
I think that's right. There's going to be a big culture change aspect to each one of these. I don't want to minimize, though, what are the best practices? What are the right tools? So in IT, I mentioned it earlier, terminating projects when it becomes
Right.
clear that they're not going to work, chunking them up, things that are second nature to you, but knowing sort of the top 3 or 4 that you just insist upon
Yep.
is also helpful. So, but there is going to be a change management element to each, but I think there's also going to be a set of best practices. And then there's also going to be the oomph you can help
it
bring
also-
to get this stuff done.
It also strikes me in listening to both discussions so far is the unique challenge for people like you is the one, Tony, you're talking about is leadership, political leadership comes and goes on a very short time frame, and the SES stays.
Yes.
And this is a different situation in business where, at least in theory, the CEO might be there for a while, at least they have to think that. And so they can either have change fatigue or wait you out. And so the first discussion we had about the SES strikes me as very important to embed the change orientation
Yes.
and create the continuity so that if Tony isn't here in a couple of years, for whatever reason, the continuity remains. That's a unique challenge
Yes.
to the government, it
It's,
seems
really,
to me.
it's not just the CEO, it's as if your whole team.
Yeah,
Right.
so that makes the SES
Yes.
critical,
Yes.
because they have to be the carriers of change beyond this administration.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but
But
it
with
seems
customer-
that the part of the issue is defining the mission of the organization in a way that the outcomes you want are embedded deep in the organization.
Don't
For
change.
example, I'll just make this up. If your objective is to process Pell Grants, that's one thing. If your objective is to process Pell, it is to make certain that students can get Pell Grants quickly and timely with the minimum amount of effort and maximum amount of ease, then working that set of issues gives you a longer longitudinal view and gives you a broader perspective than if you define it as processing
And then
grants.
driving those goals into performance reviews and
But the aha
And then I-
moment, the aha moment that I think all of us in private sector have gone through is specifically with customer service. What you might consider, the movements online, lead in both lower cost and better customer service. And I think if you recognize that, and it's going to take many years, all of us have to offer it in multiple channels. Everybody who goes to what's perceived as the cheaper, online mechanisms find better customer service. And so this is a win-win if there's ever.
that's one of our big cultural challenges right now. That people are starting to push back and say, you're pushing us on customer service, you're pushing us on budget at the same time. How do I square that?
Right.
And I think we believe it's actually one helps solve the other.
Exactly.
They're aligned, but I think you could help us with that also. And this movement to online has been quite slow. I mean, again, it's at best a 20 on that 100 scale. And so how you actually have successfully migrated from telephone-based and other ways of interacting to online would be an area rich of best
Do you move the
best
mobility
practices.
at the same time? Do you do,
Right.
and so,
Two issues I see, just listening to the presentations. One, Tony, that you mentioned is, the switch over from the political appointments to the folks that stay a while. And it seems to me that 2 years is such a fast time and hardly time to, figure out where the good people are, get the non-performers out and replaced, and kind of build your team underneath you so that the goals are ongoing. That just seems like an incredible amount to accomplish in two years, and really, I've heard it's really 18 months, in terms of political appointees. So that's one challenge. The second is to your point about online. It seems that moving a lot of customer service online is a benefit, and you get rid of a lot of the people performance issues or attitude issues, but a lot of companies these days are outsourcing to other countries, and that brings up the STEM education discussion. Do we really have the people qualified to be able to perform these online services? Because I'm sure the government isn't going to be outsourcing anytime soon. So that's not a potential option. So I think, there are a couple of issues just in terms of finding the right people, building the right team, and sustaining that over a period of time, as you mentioned, when you have change fatigue or other issues and other impediments that we might not necessarily have in corporate America.
Timekeeper role. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.
Contract. So 1 out of $6 is contracted out. So over $500 billion.
Over what?
Over $500 billion a year. The president put a stake in the ground March of 2009, so a couple of years into office, that we were going to become more efficient and effective in contracting and save $40 billion. Last year, total contracting actually went down for the first time in, I believe, 13 years, from $550 billion to $535 billion, as we've started to terminate ineffective contracts, pool our purchasing power for the first time, ramp up competition, move where we can from fixed price contracts, from cost reimbursement contracts to fixed price contracts where appropriate, which decreases the risk. Martha Johnson runs the organization that's right in the middle of contracting, the General Services Administration, and Dan Gordon is part of our team here at OMB and leads procurement policy across the federal government. So let me have the two of them walk through a couple of minutes of setup, and then the discussion will catch.
Well, I want to just begin by saying thank you so much for lending your support and good ideas to these efforts. Gail is one of my new best friends in Washington, so it's wonderful to see her at the table. And I have to acknowledge Tim, who in the dark ages interviewed me at my MBA program and opened the door so that my career started, in the chops of, manufacturing. Anyway, it's good to see you. Martha. The first slide here basically says it's big. GSA you should think of as the membrane between industry and government. We really play a role right in the middle there, and we're constrained in a number of different ways, but we play a membrane role. We need to be healthy, and the contracting vehicles are the way we make that healthy. We oversee them, we help write the policies around them, and we execute them. But it hasn't always been that way. The first 50 years of GSA's life, we were sort of the company store. You had to come to us to buy things. Mid-1990s procurement law changed all of that, and we entered into a new world of competition. It was about the time we were giving credit cards to federal employees to be able to buy more conveniently and with a better trail of information. And it also took GSA away from being the company store and put this out to the agencies. As a result, we could not leverage the same kind of buying power because we were not really, we were more decentralized, and the competition was meant to encourage those kinds of better prices. But more recently, we've discovered, this is something that Dan has championed, and we've been executing as fast as we can, is the notion of facilitating the government into more cooperative buying. And so while contracting is big, we have attacked commodity buying with this notion that we need to sort of join up a little bit more and exercise a little bit more leverage as we buy. So the next question becomes services contracting. And as the government has outsourced more and more, services contracts are becoming bigger and bigger and ballooning. And this covers everything from IT services through janitorial services. And this is a conundrum that we want to put in front of you. Slide 2 basically says we've made some runs at this. And I come from the private sector enough to know that I'm looking for good ideas, but I know we're all struggling with this to some extent as our whole economy shifts into a services economy. The issues are significant. How do you do results-based services? How do you qualify contractors? Are we still using the 1950s model of where did you go to school? How long is your resume? What's your hourly rate? And how do we compare that in some sort of equatable form? How do we innovate? Services innovation to me is one of our biggest challenges. I don't see enough of it in academic conversation. Just how do we think about that? Getting best value, and then of course all the revenue models that basically are around hourly rates. How do we manage in that? And inside all of those issues, which are your issues as well, I'm well aware. The federal government has statutory requirements around competition that preclude long-term partnerships. We try to, we have some real commitments to nodding to small businesses, service-disabled veteran-owned businesses, et cetera. So we have some social overlay on our contracting, and there's also issues around umbrella contracts and how you do task orders against them and all of the sort of paraphernalia of how we contract in the government. Now, that was sort of like in 2 seconds because they only gave me a couple of minutes. But I basically want you to know that we've got the big questions in front of us, and we would really appreciate your best thinking about this. How can we assure that the government is getting its best value out of its services contracts? How should we be making our make-buy decisions? Now, we all understand that some of the make-buy decisions have been politically motivated. You know, there's been politics behind the notions around outsourcing. But how can we better frame that so we can make that conversation a little bit more transparent and sort of sophisticated for everyone? What lessons can we borrow from commodity buying? And then what challenges do you see as our focus moves from really focusing on commodity buying into this whole services arena, which is where the big, big enchilada is? So that is it in a nutshell. Do you want to say a couple of things? Dan's my partner in crime. So.
Absolutely. Just to pile on to what Martha said, so we have even more questions where we would love input from you. I should tell you, by the way, that I've been here for less than a year and a half. I'm a lawyer by background. I was a GAO for 17 years before that, and before that I was in private practice in a law firm in Pennsylvania.
I'm surrounded by lawyers.
We're trying to protect you. A couple of tough issues we're wrestling with. The one that the government is called requirements definition. When you're buying services, how do you tell the companies in advance what you're looking for? Very important in our world, because if you don't have a clear statement of what you're looking for, you run into performance problems. And the flip side of that is, how do you do contract management over services? We struggle mightily, and we would love suggestions in that area. It is very tough. A cousin of that problem, just to keep piling on, a cousin of that is the issue of us being completely dependent on the contractors. We have turned so much to contractors that I hear people tell me when I'm going around talking to agencies, they'll tell me they don't have any federal employee that knows how to write a contract. They use a contractor to write contracts for other contractors.
It's a real problem.
How do you deal with over-reliance? I have people that tell me that no federal employee understands their own IT operation overall, that they have to turn to contractors to do their IT systems planning because there aren't federal employees who understand it enough. We could go on and on in terms of the over-reliance on contractors. How do you deal with that question?
Can I just ask a couple of things?
Yes.
Well, just going back a step, when the change was made from being the company store to distributing procurement decisions, if you could wave a magic wand and reverse that, would you?
I was asked that in my confirmation hearings, and my answer is absolutely no. I would not go back. I do not think having a company store really does engender the right kind of competition. It keeps it way too funneled through GSA, and it is true that when you're a monopoly, you act like a monopoly. And I was here as chief of staff in the agency right after that law changed, and it really did help us understand how to spell marketing, how to spell competition, and how to get into the notion that we wanted to demand performance. So no, I would not go back to making that a mandate. I think we should earn it, though. People can turn to GSA, and if we're the best, they will use us, and that's the challenge I put to the organization. The contracting competency that we have and is across the government has been a bit diluted over the last 10, 15 years for a number of reasons around downsizing government and pushing people out and so on.
So this is naive, and maybe I'm just not understanding how it works, but can everybody buy their own paper clips?
Yes, you can basically make a fair amount of purchases on a credit card.
And aren't you losing huge purchasing power by the government must buy gazillions of paper clips and not letting everybody buy their own?
What a great example.
You should see the trainload of rubber bands I once saw for the post office.
Right.
This is where our cooperative buying has moved forward. What we did was we collectively facilitated a number of agencies who said, yes, we will join up. We then sort of let a contract across about 15 businesses, including the big ones, Home Depot and and so on. And then a number of small businesses, and we said, we will agree that we will put our money into these, this handful of businesses for office supplies, for printing services. We're moving into a couple of other arenas. And so we're playing with that model, and they are giving us very good prices. So if you're a government person with a card, you go into Office Depot, you will get the government rate.
So you're satisfied you're getting the purchasing power of the government?
I think with that cooperative buying, we're getting there. We want more and more agencies to
Buy
join up.
commodities.
And this is for commodities mostly.
Okay, I know you want to talk about services, but I just want to understand whether you're getting the potential bargaining power from
We're
on
beginning.
commodities.
We know how to do. I think we know how to do it much better than we did even 18 months ago. The first stab at this, there are all kinds of ways that implementation takes its time, but we've got the model and we're repeating it across other types of commodities, and it seems to be working. If Scott Gould were still here, he would talk about how VA is really out in front on using these contracts, and they're working, and they're saving them a lot of money. Budget pressures are forcing people into this cooperative arrangement, so that's helping.
How do you motivate that type of cooperation then? What's the motivation for the other leaders?
Well, right now it is a very clear savings. It's just sheer savings. People who need to cut 30, 40, 50 million out of their, are saying, what can you do for us, GSA? And we say, gee, we have this helpful little notion.
I apologize, I haven't told Jeff that for me, so I'm going to chime in on his behalf, but I think that is from our mind, that's one of the key differences that we love advice on, is that how do you then get, I would imagine say that across a large corporation, how do you get far-flung operations to agree instead of saying, I want to make my own contract for X? And how do you incent behavior when you don't have a stick necessarily? Unfortunately, it's paperclips, and in aggregate, it's a lot of money, but in the moment, it's a paperclip, and I'm really going to tell that executive, which I'm trying to get to do lots of big things, that he has to use my contract. So
You're going to have
we
the
think that's
budget,
a big issue.
but the federal budget's going to create the big stick.
That is creating it right now, and now it's asking the next question, which is services, which are harder to sort of figure out a model around.
It raises the question of, to the extent that the agency spends less in one category, do they have the flexibility to redeploy those dollars in other categories? Or is it a line item? To the extent that they spend less in paper clips, can they spend more on something else or not?
Well, there's a fair amount of discretion inside a person's arena. They can decide they want to try to, they can even move it into personnel. But every agency has its own sort of constraints around this, given their overall macro roll-up of the budget and what they need. So they might be pulling it away from you.
One question I have is that in our experience in selling to the government is that the procedures that are required to qualify different accounting systems and so forth, so it costs a lot more to sell to the government, and that's baked into the price. And so is part of the scope here that we can address the front-end issues of qualification and change that? It is.
Oh, yes, I think we need to be looking at that as well. I mean, it goes to all kinds of things. There are a lot of things baked into these on-site contractors in terms of office space. We're paying for their office space when they come into the government to help. There are hidden costs around a lot of these contracting, a lot of these contracts that we're beginning to unpack. And I think we need to scrub the whole thing from front end, cradle to cradle.
So you asked a question, you said, how should an agency handle make or buy decisions? How much is that going on where we're actually spending the money to make lots of things that are already available commercially?
Well, I meant make in the sort of mythical sense of, should we onboard and have the talent in-house, or should we contract?
I got it.
Outsourcing services.
Got it.
It's outsourcing services, but
Services.
yeah.
Thank you.
So staff or buy for services.
Okay.
And it's so interesting because, for example, in communications, ran into this recently in a hearing. Communications in an agency has often been sort of public relations. Well, recently, agencies now really need crisis communication support. So do you staff up with a bunch of crisis communication types, or do you go and buy it when you need it? Mm-hmm. Well, we went and bought it when we need it, and we were in front of the Congress, because it doesn't have that, you're the stick in the hard place, rock in a hard place makes it a difficult trade-off in the moment, but it goes to the innovations issues. As more and more services are required and better services are required, how do we stay ahead of that, or do we buy it?
Okay, timekeeper's back.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good person with me, Valerie Jarrett, who's the President Senior Advisor and main point person for the business community.
Hello, everybody. Please have a seat. Don't get up. I'm not going to interrupt for long. The president's preparing for a press conference, and he asked me if I would stop by and just tell you guys how grateful he is for your service and how important this is to the administration. And I see a lot of friends around the table, and we really appreciate you doing this. He's taking this very seriously. We have a perfect person in Jeff to head this up. Jeff and I were just up at the President's Export Council, where Jeff made a presentation about how the overall examination of how to improve government and make it more user-friendly, and the fact that he's focusing first on trade and what we can do to really deliver on behalf of the customer, and the customer are the business community, businesses. So your input in this is just invaluable. And I just want to say thank you. And it's terrific to have you guys all here. Get back to work.
Thank you, Valerie.
Oh, yeah, were there any questions?
Any questions for Valerie? Thank you, Valerie. Did we get a dose of contracting?
We got a dose.
We did. We sure did. Okay. Complex terrain, important terrain. Last topic, and we're going to have David Hayes, who is the Deputy Secretary at Interior, and Vivek's going to join us again. And we're going to talk about IT. This is a topic area that we know we can benefit because we already have. Vivek, maybe you want to say a minute or two on the work that came out of our winter meeting and then hand it over to David.
Sure. So the president actually invited about 50 CEOs from across the country to help look at how we could modernize IT within the federal government. Out of that came a number of best practices that we've been very, very focused on implementing. And a big part of our IT reform agenda has actually been built on a lot of the input we got from that meeting.
Good. David.
And just very briefly, I'll go through a few points here. First of all, thank you for having us, and we're delighted to be working with you. I can tell you that as a chief operating officer of the Department of the Interior, an organization with 70,000 employees, and trying to manage 20% of the landmass of the U.S., we need your help. And IT is a perfect example. It's stunning how much the government puts out for IT, $80 billion annually on IT systems. And at any one time, we have a huge number of important IT projects, 12,000 major systems across the government right now. We are finding, and Vivek has been a true inspirational leader on this, that these projects are being more expensive, taking longer, delivering fewer capabilities than planned. That's probably not a surprise to you, but it was a surprise, I think, to the government as we systematically, with Vivek's leadership, went through a process I'll describe in a minute. We found that about 40% of our major projects are not on track. The root causes of the problem are known. Many of these major projects are not scoped properly. Their deliverables are way in the future. Program managers often don't have the technical knowledge to do the right scoping and to do the right tracking. And we have a unique problem in the federal government with our budget cycle. We often have to make decisions years in advance. Just to give you an example, I have a meeting today on our fiscal year 2013 budget process, which is beginning now. So if we want to put a major new IT system in place, we're looking at the 2013 budget process. It would start in 2013, and the deliverable would be 3 or 4 years after that. So what technology are we selecting today for an application 5 or 6 years from now? A challenge. Here's what we have been working on through the President's Management Council and with Vivek's leadership. First is an IT dashboard that I recommend to all of you. This is heresy for the government to show its dirty laundry, but this is the Obama administration approach to things. And I'll tell you, it works. You know that disclosure works. What we are doing is we are tracking investments, putting grades on how we are doing on major IT projects, and we are finding our managers don't like to be embarrassed, and this is a big motivator. Also, Vivek holds monthly tech stat sessions with the IT folks, the CIOs in our organizations. These are tough sessions. Our IT folks have never encountered anything like it. I was described as when Vivek comes over with his team, people are shaking in their boots because they're asking the hard questions. What are you getting? What are you delivering? We had two major projects at Interior that were materially affected by this. A project, a $56 million project, we had sunk a cost of $56 million. We had another $38 million ready to go. This project was delivering nothing. We cut it off. We stopped the bleeding. We're not doing this anymore. We salvaged some pieces of it, but let's not pour a lot of more good money after this. And we've also turned around other projects as well. We actually have patterned in our department a similar kind of mortarboard approach that we call ISTAT to ask the hard questions. Vivek has come up with a 25-point IT reform plan that we are working to implement across our departments. These are the major elements of it. I think they all make sense. I will say that and you can read them here. We need to make sure we've got the right folks in these jobs. We need to integrate the program teams, do best practices sharing, which I think we're facilitating with the IT dashboard and other things, and supporting modular development. This is, to me, the biggest sort of lessons learned from this exercise. Let's not create these behemoths that no one can sort of have any fingers on any controls on. Instead, let's get modular results on timetables that are realistic and that can be in fact tracked. We got to work with Congress to have more flexible IT budget models. And we need to strengthen the structures that we're putting in place really for the first time here in this administration to review major projects. So our reform agenda, we've got three key objectives. One is this modular approach, using it to drive the average size and duration down and the success rate up for these major IT programs. We are looking to improve the yield on our IT infrastructure spending and shift spending from redundant, underutilized infrastructures to mission priority programs. We have a problem in the federal government that you would expect of stovepipes. Let me give you a quick example. We have the National Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management, the Bureau of Reclamation, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. We have 8 or 9 of these organizations, each with 10,000 people. They all have their own IT systems. We have one server for every 7 employees in our department. We can have co-located folks, and they all have their own IT.
Do the secretaries desire to send an email for all of this?
Right. We couldn't. The secretary came in and said, "I want to talk to my 70,000 employees." We had no way to do it. We had
to. How many months to?
Many months.
To get it.
And now we have it. This big success. Hey, we can talk to our employees. Phenomenal problems.
Let me propose wireless technology.
Sorry. Greg, I don't know you, but I think I know what company you work for. And we're moving toward cloud first, which is hugely helpful and a godsend, frankly, given this huge problem of sort of physical infrastructure that needs to be addressed. So that's our quick rundown. Vivek, I don't know if you want to make another comment or two, but we'd love to just spend a few minutes with you and get some feedback from you.
And on slide 14, you see the types of questions that if we were to pick this terrain, that we would ask you.
Two questions. One is, does the $80 billion includes the development costs and the infrastructure, or how would you split the two between infrastructure and development?
It's about $20 billion, 24 to be precise, is spent on infrastructure, and the rest is spent on mission IT in terms of development and maintenance of these large-scale mission-critical systems.
But in terms of new development each year, is that's in the balance between the 24 and the 80?
So the new development would actually be about, I would say, about 15 to 20 billion every year.
Billion.
Yep.
Okay, and that's the full expense for that?
Exactly.
Okay. Second question, you talked about modular. How does services-oriented architecture come into play? Is that part of the modular solution? And the whole question of architectural roadmaps and blueprints for the various business functions that you're trying to accomplish?
So the challenge in the past, as the Deputy Secretary articulated, unfortunately what was happening with architecture in a lot of the agencies was that it became a paper that would just get filed on shelves, where a lot of these agencies would spend 5 years, 40 million, and then I would sit in a meeting and ask, well, what did we get? And what you got was a book at the end of 5 years. So what we're trying to move to in terms of the cloud first policy and open APIs and so architecture is to say, we don't necessarily need to architect and engineer these massive enterprise systems. One of the biggest pain points for the US government actually is in the ERP space. So we actually halted earlier this summer about $20 billion worth of financial systems across the board, because the dream that was sold to the government was that your financial system will balance your books, it will track your assets, manage your supply chains, and make you coffee, right? And we realized that, at the Department of Defense, they spent 12 years and $1 billion and the project failed. And that's unfortunately not the only example we have.
That's not unique to the government.
But I was at that meeting, earlier that you alluded to, Vivek, and I said there, anything beyond 18 months for an architectural project right now, I just don't know how you do it. And so if you're trying to figure out architecturally what happens in 2015, I think that's fundamentally flawed already.
Right. Yes. Well, which we do need to change. We talked before, how much flexibility do we have in changing law?
Right.
This is an area where we're working very closely with the Hill because it's a pretty obvious problem.
Right.
So that we can be, and there's some pilots already going on where we're getting dollars, but the dollars will be flexible. At the same time, you got to streamline the procurement process though too.
Right.
And that it's two problems right now. It's a budgeting process and then it's a procurement time frame. But we have some successful pilots where the Hill is working with us to change that budget.
And architecturally, it's nice to see is you finally have a federal CIO and a CTO, because that long-term continuity of putting all of these modular things together is critical to your point.
Question on, this is, I think we're all smiling because this is something we all, the journey, so I applaud the infrastructure discussion and taking it on, but who is the business, if you will, owner of the trade-offs of IT? So, Vivek, you're the IT, but the way I've personally seen this ever work is that you have to have a business owner that has the yes/no vote IT. So if it's split out,
Right.
do we have that? Do we have a Vivek on? Yeah, but do we have one person that's the tiebreaker across, or tell me how the budgets work across all the agencies?
Let me give you an example at Interior, and then maybe you can give a broader example, because this was a big problem for us, and it went with the stovepipe situation. So every of our major stovepipes has their own CIOs, and then we had regional organizations, and a lot of them had their own regional CIOs. I mean, we had, I don't know, Andrew, how many CIOs? 30 CIOs in our department. So all of whom think that they have decision-making authority. What we did, and we just broke a lot of China over the last month on this, what we did is we made Andrew our CIO, who's from Hewlett-Packard and has got tremendous business experience, and was formerly our chief information officer, but not in reality. Then what we did is we changed the job descriptions for all this other 8 bureau CIOs and said, basically, you're implementers. You are not decision makers in terms of deciding our direction. You're going to help implement. And this was hard because you're onto, but the secretary did it with a secretarial order. We socialized it. We're very hopeful that this new structure will be helpful.
And I think that the leadership that Deputy Secretary Hayes has shown has actually become the roadmap for other deputy secretaries across the government. And I think you're absolutely right. At the end of the day, if the chief operating officers aren't owning it, what you get is this culture of faceless accountability. Just to give you a data point, the US government went from 432 data centers in 1998 to 2,094 data centers this year. And the reason is because you have all this duplicative spending, investments across the board, and so they're not a single business owner, but now the deputy secretaries are driving very, very hard to begin scaling this across the board.
How long did it take to kill the $56 million project?
How much did it cost?
How long was the process? You decided, we got to kill this. How long did it take to kill the project?
I'd say over a process of 2 or 3 months of discussion, starting with the tech stat session that Vivek had. And the hardest part was taking away the $38 million that had been hoarded by that agency to complete the project. You know, there's no assurance that coming behind that was going to be money to do whatever needed to be replaced by it. But anyway, frankly, the fact that this is a government-wide effort and that our department is not singled out, this is something that is happening across the departments through Vivek. That helped us tremendously. I don't think we could have done it on our own.
I think across that 2 or 3 month period of time, we reviewed, working with the deputy secretaries, and Vivek coordinated the process, more than 26 projects. And there were several terminations, several rescopings, and a bunch that were on track, and we sort of said that's on track. And that was important both because it's a significant amount of money and they're mission critical applications, but then the learning from that, we're now applying to other learning.
So any further advice you all have in terms of, you know, I'm a COO, but we're also, you know, testifying in front of Congress every other day and doing a lot of other things. As any COO is doing, any thoughts you have on sort of red flags for us or special ideas that you've come up with or techniques that have worked? Love to hear. I know time is short.
Why don't we do?
So can I ask you just one quick question? You're the COO. What percentage of your time is spent on the operations of your department, as opposed to testifying and all the other?
Well, you know, it depends on how you define it, I think. You define operations broadly in terms of implementing our priorities, which I do. I'd say the vast majority of my time is spent in that regard. Some of it may sound like it's policy implementation, which it is, but if we can't get that through our 70,000 employees and sort of get everyone marching together, we're not going to implement the president's priorities. So,
you know, there's obviously overlap, but the basic divide of the secretaries will spend more time externally.
Right.
And the deputy secretaries will be the COOs running the operations. Now, there are lots of competing demands.
Right.
But I think each deputy secretary would say my main responsibility is the operations.
We stay at home more and mind the store.
Let's break on IT. We have a few minutes before our new end to the open session. Why don't we just get any top line reactions to which of the topics?
Thank you.
Which of the topics? Leadership development, customer service, contracting, IT. I'm not sure that we have to whittle the list way down, and we'll also, across time, think about other topics that we should include that we haven't talked about at all. But what resonates in that intersection of important, and I think all four of these topics are important, and where private sector expertise on change management and best practices might be most powerful.
Well, before we get there, though, Jeff, I just wanted to say, the candor and the framing of the questions and the issues was actually very refreshing to see. So I think there's, I wanted to compliment actually the team on a really clear understanding of what the issues are and how to frame it. And so before we get in,
I think it's, and again, I don't want to underestimate in any way the good progress that's been made already, but I think there's a lot of optimism that off of this base of some successful pilots and some early progress, you can really help us accelerate. But I think each deputy secretary understands the challenges ahead and is open about those challenges. At the same time, I want to make sure we're clear about there are very good people on these teams, both political folks and career folks that are very hardworking, well-intentioned, and want to do the right thing. So lots of challenges ahead, but I think there's reason to
the observation I would make is just a very off the top of the head reaction is that in all four areas, the answers seem obvious. I mean, none of that's rocket science. The leadership, how you buy stuff, good customer service. So we can bring ideas, but it seems to me it's about change management. And is part of our role being the heavies on the outside that allow you to say, well, this group recommended, where you can't do that yourself?
I think there is a change management aspect to each one of these. It might be 50% of the counsel we get is around change management. I think also prioritizing the tools is important. So where do you start in terms of taking services that are offline and bringing them online? Or how do you actually get some early wins in strategic sourcing? Again, we might be asking you to go back a decade or two, but that's quite helpful. And then yes, Tim, to be able to say, this has happened before. There's a group of very successful company CEOs who have validated that this is the right sequencing, that these are the right tools for change management can be quite helpful. It's very helpful in the IT terrain.
Well, I think the change management aspect, I would then go to the leadership development, because is that you can't get the change unless you've got the leadership.
I agree.
Organized.
So that strikes me as
First move and
I think everything comes back to that SES cohort. Energizing them, establishing continuity across that organization, having an ownership of them so that they're a sustainable leadership cohort succession, having them sustain the mission across all of this. Because change management, as Deborah was saying, can't be done in 2 years. And so all of these things, as has been said, the answers aren't the issue. The answers are knowable. It's execution over a sustained period of time, and that's the cohort that's going to do it.
yes.
And making, and excuse me, just one other point, making, as one of our guests said, making them into a honorable, distinguished, respected group of civil servants that feel good about what they're doing and can sustain that change over time. I think that's the key to all of it. All of these
We
things.
need to be adding to those ranks.
Yes, absolutely.
With your retirements and
Along that line, when I think about the horizontal embeddedness of this, I think that, and I applaud, because it's always the thing that people least like to take on, but I think the IT and the technology initiative is critical, and getting the wiring of the organization to work horizontally, which is going to allow you to have the people more effectively and free up the resources. So I do see this notion of infrastructure, efficiency, technology, embeddedness, completely linked to your ability to develop efficiency benefits, whether it's access to data, but also towards the effectiveness of people to work across the organization.
I would agree. I think the information technology, however, is also very much related to customer service.
It empowers the other two.
The information technology, by and large, is what drives the customer service, but with a vision from the various units about what their customers' needs and expectations are and the multiple choices of contact that are going to be necessary. So there really is a bit of a trifecta of leadership, of technology, and of customer service that really triangulate on improving the customer experience and improving the efficiency and effectiveness of government, building on the senior leadership core.
So following on this, so take leadership development aside for a moment, because that's, I think, it's how we drive everything else, in my opinion. If you look at the other ones, what I think about is a couple things. One, what are we driving? Efficiency? Is our goal ultimately, how do we maximize the budget? Right? How do we get the most for our dollars? Right? And so then you'd want to say, because see, the customer service one is experience and dollars. The bottom two, contracting and management information, those are the dollars, right? So that's one thing I would tell you. The second thing that I look at when I look at this list is you really have to go through and make sure it's really clear what we're going to try to do in IT. Because having looked at a lot of companies who try to transform IT, you start and get nowhere. And so it has to have really clear objectives of what you're trying to do in that bucket.
So just along those lines, I think that we all have different interactions. We're an advisory board. We're not going to tell Vivek how to run IT. We're not going to tell the Secretary of Commerce how he or she's going to run his department. we all would have a tendency to do that, right? Because we do that. I think this group should do two things, all in. Ideation of best practices, feeding into these work streams. And the second is we should work leadership development. And what I would call leadership development and operating governance. So we might propose a set of common metrics, irrespective of an agency, that gives a level of comparison. When you run a division or a business unit and you say corporate's going to do it, the antibodies come in. We're not going to suggest or strong arm or muscle or impose buy this server or that. I really think, Jeff, this group does best practices along maybe those contracting, and leadership development / operating governance.
Agreed.
And if we would do that, and we could pick a couple of areas, and smaller is actually better here.
Yes.
And we'd be much more focused and impactful. That would be my suggestion.
You've captured it very well. So I mean, it strikes me as leadership development is probably
it's critical.
It's our issue for the whole time we're together.
Yeah.
Then where do we focus, your second bucket, where do we focus initially? One or two or three other areas, might be one or two.
Might be one or two.
Right. In terms of best practice generation. And the other three areas are candidates for that, admittedly broad candidates that would have to be sort of scoped more narrowly. If you're going to pick IT, you don't want to do best practice across all of IT, or we're doing IT infrastructure. So you've captured it well. There'll be a leadership development for this group, change management component that goes across everything we do. That's probably a permanent subcommittee.
My aha.
Subcommittees around best practice generation in certain areas.
I don't know the details of how government works. I think Jeff said it earlier. These 7,000 people, they make the trains run.
Yes.
They are the government.
Yes.
If we can impact, develop, suggest, maybe compensation's off the table, but there's a way to attract, develop, rotate, measure. The president speaks to them. There's a specialness associated with this layer. We will have made a big impact. Because they're going to run this.
A corporate best practice, a corporate best practice in any company I've been in is, and Ron asked the question early on, is owning, I hate that word, but responsibility for monitoring, watching the top people in the company, whether it's the top 100, in this case 7,000 is a large number, but those are the people who, somebody called it civil society. These are the people that sustain the government. And nobody's watching them as a whole.
It's a great topic. It's a topic that's been debated at the PMC, agreeing with it. Is it done at the level of 7,000 or is it done at the level of 300 or 400? But it's a very interesting.
But whoever it is, those are the people that sustain. And I was struck by, 25 years to become one of them. That in,
Less than 1% coming from outside.
Right. So there's a whole issue of who are they, where do they come from, how do they get there, how do they stay, so take compensation off the table.
Yes.
There's a lot of other levers to sustain them, make them feel part of the community. I think the point you were making is technology is part of creating a community internally, not just customer service. And I think that is the greatest lever we have for everything else. And if we did nothing else, this group, but create that community as a permanent, sustainable, exciting, compelling, worthy group of people that goes beyond administration, political leaders come and go, and they are the sustainable change agents for all this other activity. That would be a pretty significant
I was putting
contribution.
myself in their shoes. I mean, it's almost like we would have a new board every 2 years. Completely new board. How you accomplish that continuity for them to do the great stuff.
Yes.
I think just one more thing.
Please.
It seems to me the 2 points that Greg made, and I totally agree with you, Jeff. I don't know if our role can be, I don't know if we can be helpful in illuminating the obstacles that are unique to government. So if you're talking about IT, one of the big elements of success on IT is getting the project started well. And it sounds to me like you start behind the curve every time. You're 2 years away from the start of the project, at minimum, every time. So and I don't know if we'd be helpful in that way, in helping illuminate the obstacles. We may not be able to solve them, but to be able to lay out flexible spending for IT is huge. If you really want to be successful, it's not just about the execution; it's about getting started.
Let's break. What we're going to do is we're going to close our open session across the next few weeks. we'll refine topic selection, but I think we have a pretty good hypothesis already. Clearly, this session makes me even more optimistic about how much you can help us here. And what we'll do is we'll reconvene in 5 minutes or so for just a half hour or so working lunch on some administrative matters.
Great.
Thank you.